You talked before about there's never enough money to go around.
Never.
I think you've probably lived through some of those battles. Another way of talking about that is that, it seems like everybody has some claim on resources. Some claims are stronger, some claims are weaker. But Ron Ehrenberg, who's a writer on higher education, a scholar, says, well, why do costs keep rising at selective private universities, or any universities for that matter? And he says because academics there's no restraint on what they want to be or how they want to think of themselves in terms of the excellence of their discipline or what they can do. So he describes them as cookie monsters. That they want cookie, they always want another cookie.
Right.
Now, considering that everybody can have a decent claim on resources, that they are they're not just greedy cookie monsters that want a cookie for no good reason. How do you constrain that? How do you manage? Do you control? If someone says, well, they only gave me $10, but I really need to spend $15, how do you work with them to make sure it stays within 10 when they have good reason to want to spend 15?
Sure. Most budgeting is done in what we call incremental budgeting. That is, you look at on the expense budget how much you're allowed to spend, what your budget is in the current year, and then the budget process will say, what does inflation require for you to be able to continue doing the same things in the subsequent year? And then once we've covered that expense, we then leave open the possibility of a unit or a school having an increment to its budget that would go beyond just what is necessary to cover inflation. How does that come about? Well, a dean would make a proposal to the provost and say, I have a very high priority in this particular department. We would like to hire 1 or 2 additional faculty members. And if it's in the sciences, when you recruit faculty, you very often also need to have money set aside to build a laboratory for them. The provost naturally would say, but how are we going to pay for it? The dean may say, I believe that I can increase enrollment and generate additional revenue. I can raise money through philanthropy, and these scientists will be very productive in terms of earning grants from the federal government and from foundations that will bring in additional revenue. So we look at that, we put it all together, and we say, are the proposed revenues sufficient to cover the proposed expenses? In the dean's eyes, the answer is yes, but part of the budget process is to evaluate the likelihood of success of those particular revenue streams coming in. It's much easier, I think, to project with confidence what expenses will be and the likelihood that the expenses will be incurred than it is to project revenues and say what is the probability that those revenues will be received.
So one of the functions of the budget office is in essence to vet if the president and a dean or provost have discussions about the future, they can then agree on a future direction, but you need the budget office to sort of make sure the numbers hold together, to sign off, to be able to go to the president and say, that plan works, but only if the following things are done?
That's exactly right. And the budget office needs to approach all of these proposals in a very dispassionate, non-political way. The budget office needs to have the credibility so that whether it's the dean or the provost or a faculty member who's looking at the analysis and looking at the product of the budget office will feel confident that sound judgment, sound analysis was applied to the particular matter at hand.
So a lot of what you're just talking about is finding ways between, for instance, the discussions between deans, presidents, the support of the budget staff, to tame or to manage or to anticipate the future, so that, because the future hasn't happened yet. Anything can happen. And you're trying to, part of the planning process is to get a handle on what could go wrong and how to manage. So I wanted to observe this, because we talk about financial management having many aspects. If you think about accounting, for instance, a lot of judgment in accounting, But at least the past has already happened. And so you can make judgment calls about how to categorize this revenue or that expense. But budgeting has an entirely other dimension of uncertainty in it beyond how to categorize things. It's about the future that hasn't happened.
Right.
So, all right, we've just talked about the role of the budget in, for instance, supporting a negotiation between a dean and a president over a priority. But what about all the things that are simply you're unable to, with a discussion, control? How many students are going to come? What's the nature of the economy? Whether philanthropy will be supported? As you're putting a budget together, how do you deal with those multiple uncertainties about which you can't, through a management process, really do exert any particular control?
Every responsible budget must have adequate contingency. And the contingency may take multiple forms. The most basic form is to have a line item in a budget plan which is labeled contingency, and there's a dollar amount associated with that.
So everybody sees it, they know it's there.
Everyone sees it, they know that it's there. And you want to go into the budget year assuming that that contingency is going to remain at the end of the year the same amount as it was at the beginning of the year. Knowing, however, that because of the uncertainties, such as you just described, there will be claims on that contingency during the course of the year. There are other forms of contingency. There are contingencies that the CFO and the provost may agree will be buried, as we say, buried in the budget.
Less transparent.
That are not transparent, that are intentionally not transparent. Why is that? One reason may be that when the contingency number is so visible, many people may think that it's there to be spent, and they may conduct themselves in such a way as to assume that their activities will be supported by that contingency. Contingencies can also take the form of your assumptions regarding revenue. So you may have a plan to increase enrollment, let's say, in order to generate a certain amount of additional revenue for the institution. So you would have a target of, let's say, 50 additional students. But you would budget only for 40 additional students, and you're giving yourself that leeway in case you fall short. You may find you have more than 50 students who are willing and financially able to attend your institution, but they don't have the academic credentials that you require. So you're only going to admit 40 out of the 50, and there may be melt during the course of the enrollment cycle. So there are different ways to include in a budget contingencies.
So in that case, it's not even that there's a separate fund set out, but rather that by being conservative in your estimate of revenues and making certain that expenses meet that you give yourself some wiggle room in the event that revenues do come in a little bit higher.
That's right. And when you undertake a major project, such as building that genomics laboratory that I spoke about earlier, the project has contingencies built into it as well. So you may believe that your total design and construction costs are going to be $90 million, but the total approved budget is $100 million. You've built in contingency of $10 million.
So you've talked about contingencies at the level of central administration and contingencies that reside within a particular project, let's say a building project or capital project. But you work in a very large institution with many subunits that have their own financial ins and outs. Do they have contingencies too?
Most of them do. And that can be both a good thing and also problematic. So let me talk about both of those dimensions. Having what we call unit level or school level contingencies is good in that it allows the dean or the unit head, say it's an administrative unit, to have autonomy in the conduct of their affairs so that they are not constantly in touch with the budget office when one of the assumptions that underlie their annual budget proves to be different in reality than what they began the year with. It's bad, it can be bad in that if everyone has a contingency and these contingencies aggregate to a substantial number, what is happening unwittingly is you're limiting what the institution can do because you've locked up substantial resources that if they were brought to the fore and made available at the beginning of the planning cycle could be used for academic initiatives.
So there's a push-pull there. There's no
Right.
simple answer to
Right.
that. My wife works at a higher education institution, which shall remain nameless, but it's, the story that she tells is not an uncommon one. At the end of every fiscal year, like around now, where we are, there's a rush to, everybody runs around saying, we got to spend the money because we have too much money, otherwise we'll lose it, they'll take it away from us in the budget. That's a very common story, I remember, from city government and from lots of different budgets. It's so common, it's really a question I guess I have because I've been out of budgeting for a while. Why don't, I mean, central budgeting offices must know that this happens. Do you observe that happening at NYU, where you see people, you know what they're doing at the end of the year as they're buying computers to use up the money so they'll be able to hold, because as you say, budgeting is incremental. What you got last year tends to govern what you'll get next year. So that if you spend all your money, you can establish yourself
Right.
as a base for next year going in.
That's right. It's a complicated issue. So we address it in a couple different ways. So with respect to schools, when a school operates with a surplus at the end of the year, the school retains that surplus. And so the dean can carry that budget authority forward to a future period and use that for academic initiatives within the school, provided the dean has the approval of the provost. With administrative units that are that report up directly to, say, the CFO or to the executive vice president for operations, they typically are not allowed to retain end-of-year surpluses. So we monitor their spending during the course of the year. And we actually, although we do not have quarterly budgets, we do quarterly reviews. And if we see that there is a large amount of unspent funds that at the beginning of the fourth quarter of the year, we will meet with the heads of those units and tell them that we expect most of that money to still be available at the end of the year when the books are closed, and those excess funds will be returned to the university.
I wanted to talk about some of the almost the conflicting roles that budgets can have. On the one hand, we've talked about budgets being a mechanism or